Ready? Good evening, everyone. If you can please take your seats, we're going to get started. I want to welcome you to our Human Rights Speaker Series event for tonight. I'm John Heilman. I'm the mayor of the city of West Hollywood, and I want to welcome you here on behalf of the city. Thank you. And I want to acknowledge a few people. Our former mayor and council member, Abby Land, is here tonight. Thank you, Abby, for joining us. And I think a couple of the other council members may stop by as well. I also want to thank Andrew Campbell from our Arts and Cultural Affairs Department. Thank you for all of the programming you provide for us. And Joy, where are you? Joy, thank you for organizing this. Joy Tribble is new to the Arts and Cultural Affairs department, whatever it is. You do a lot of work. Thank you, Joy. And then Andy Lavano, who really helped organize the panelists tonight. I want to thank her as well. We're going to have an opportunity for a little dessert reception after the program. So I want to especially thank La Conversation, they're a great business here in the city on Doheny, and they've been supplying the food for our events for a number of years. I also want to give a special thank you and shout out to the Baldwin Gentlemen. The Baldwin Gentlemen is an organization that puts on programs of particular interest to the African American LGBT community, but I think they put on programs for a whole range of people, and I want to thank them for co-sponsoring tonight and promoting the event. Thank you for being here, Tori. I want to confess that it is really just serendipitous that tonight happens to be the night of the State of the Union. I swear I didn't plan it that way. I just looked to see when the auditorium was available, and wow, it just happened. So maybe it was a bit seditious, but I'm saying it's serendipitous. So this last year has been a challenging year for those of us who care about human rights and civil liberties. It has been challenging for those who are working in the trenches, and we are so fortunate tonight to have a panel of speakers who are working on issues every day in different areas, in different capacities. And I had an opportunity to hear some of them earlier today, a little sneak preview, and we are in for a really great discussion with some unique perspectives. What we're going to do is we're going to have a panel discussion at the beginning. I'm going to try to guide the discussion a little bit, and then we will have time for some question and answers from the audience. I want to first introduce our speakers who come with so much capacity and so much dedication. Some of them you're familiar with because they frequently get called upon to speak on issues of particular communities. I'm going to start with you, Salam Al-Marayati, who is the president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. To his left, from my standpoint, I guess from your right, is the incredible Sue Dunlap from Planned Parenthood of Los Angeles. Then we have, and please feel free to clap. We're really fortunate to have them all here tonight. Adam Romero is the Director of Legal Scholarship and Federal Policy and the Arnold D. Casoy Scholar of Law at the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. Josie Reyes is a nationally acclaimed poet, educator, performance artist, and speaker. And then finally, we have Maria Joden from Outright Action International, an organization that works on LGBTQ rights internationally. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists for being here. And I'm going to start with you, Salam, just because you're closest. Tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing with the Muslim Public Affairs Council and The focus tonight is on 1 year after the inauguration. What is the biggest challenge that you have faced over the last year? And I think we've seen the attacks on the Muslim community. So how has it been working in your space and doing the work that you're doing?
Well, I like the title of today's event because I think we're connecting civil rights with human rights. And I think it is all about human rights. And when you think about the situation for Muslims in general, especially in the West, there's a lie that keeps on giving us war, terrorism, militancy, and ghettoization of Muslim communities in the West. And that lie is this idea of Islam versus the West. And it has three major characteristics. The first characteristic is that Muslims are not indigenous to any country they reside in, even if they've lived there for 3 or 4 generations. They will always be viewed as aliens and incompatible with the culture in which they live. So that's the first aspect of the challenges that we face. The second aspect is that Muslims, the religion of Islam is trying to take over the West. And it comes through this idea of Islamic law and Sharia. So you see, for example, 22 states or more now legislating anti-Sharia law in their countries, in their states, even though there is no such thing as Sharia in the United States. Muslims are only 1% of the American population. And it's interesting that on the one hand, we're viewed by these Islamophobes as being inferior, too stupid to figure out, our own religion. But on the other hand, we are clever and sinister and trying to take over the West. And so you have that as the second major characteristic. The third characteristic is that, Muslims, because of some gene in the Muslim, is intrinsically violent. In other words, no other group is violent, even though you would have, for example, San Bernardino and Orlando, which were atrocities, but the number of white supremacist incidents, violence, like the Dylann Roof incident, is not viewed as a threat to Western civilization because he's one of us, whereas Muslims are part of them. So it's the them versus us mentality. Or in Las Vegas, the atrocity there, we didn't know how to deal with that situation because it was not a Muslim. Had it been a Muslim, there would have been an uproar, the country would have been turned upside down, it would have been an international crisis, Guantanamo would be more filled, and so on and so forth. So you have this double standard of looking at this from the standpoint of violence. So as for us in the United States, even though we deal with these issues politically, and there is the travel ban, and there is this idea of let us scrutinize the Muslim community more for any inkling of any kind of radicalization, it is not as bad here for Muslims as it is in other parts of the world. For example, in Bosnia, those three things happened to them exactly. They were viewed as being foreign, they were viewed as being Turkic, they were viewed as trying to take over Yugoslavia, and they were viewed as the violent ones, even though they were persecuted with ethnic cleansing, and we did not really realize the problem in Bosnia until Srebrenica. Or today, what is happening in Myanmar with the Muslims in Burma, exactly the same thing. Those three things are applied to them as was applied to the Bosnians. And you see that in many parts of the world. So for Muslims in America, we're dealing with these issues politically. And there's the travel ban, and then, as I said, there are civil liberties violations against Muslims. There are laws looking at Muslim communities only, and scapegoating Muslims for the problems that our country are facing. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing today.
Great. Thank you so much. And Sue, you are facing different challenges, but the same kind of attack and marginalization of women, and your organization has been under attack. How have you been navigating the last year under the administration?
I'm heartened that we're all still here a year later. When we were, and that was a little bit of a joke, but not so much. Thank you, 1 or 2 laughs. But a year ago at this time at Planned Parenthood, we were doing contingency planning. We were asking ourselves, how were we going to stay open when people on Medicaid were no longer going to be allowed to choose Planned Parenthood, or when Planned Parenthood was defunded? There were multiple directions in which that was coming, in which the news and the federal government were saying, we are going to make sure that people on Medicaid can't get to Planned Parenthood. But today, a year later, after 3 attempts to defund Planned Parenthood, which really means people on Medicaid can't choose Planned Parenthood, we're still here. And I'm incredibly proud, right, and I'm incredibly proud of all of us for doing the hard work of showing up. When some of us went to, and a few of you were mentioning this a few minutes ago, when some of us went to the Women's March last year, we didn't know what was going to happen. And I don't just mean in Los Angeles, but I mean all across the country. And in what feels like a very desperate, difficult time, a time where we have to ask ourselves, in the context of civil liberties and civil rights, who's hurt first and who's hurt worst. At the same time, we have to know that we as a community all across the country have stood up. I recently read an article, and some of you may have seen it too, that said that the women's marches all across the world are arguably the single largest civil rights demonstration that have ever taken place. And true or not, I find it really heartening how many people are showing up, how many people are working together, and that I feel a shift in terms of conversation, certainly about women's rights, but as we talk about women's rights, there's a greater depth to that conversation. And today, I don't think we will talk about women's rights without talking about equity and equality and immigration and understanding that women are whole people. Women don't just come for one little body part when they come to Planned Parenthood, but they come with the experience that's lived and experience all of the structural inequities that some of us sometimes don't see, but too many of the women who come to Planned Parenthood do.
That's great. And you mentioned the Women's March. I'm remiss, I didn't give a shout out to John Erickson from West Hollywood, who helped organize the marches both last year and this year. Thank you, John, for your leadership on that. Well, Adam, Sue talked a little bit about how women come to Planned Parenthood and they have multiple issues and they come from different communities, and you've approached these issues from a more research academic perspective, and you see this intersectionality of the LGBT community and how we overlap in many other communities. What has been the biggest challenge for you in this last year?
Sure. Let me first just say, for anyone who's not familiar, the Williams Institute is an academic research center at UCLA School of Law, and we have legal scholars, public health scholars, demographers, economists, community psychologists, and others, all doing research on sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's our hope that our research better informs discussion and debate about LGBT issues. And to your point, we approach our research from an intersectional lens, meaning that we always try to investigate the intersections of sexual orientation and gender identity with race and ethnicity, with immigration, with religion, with reproductive rights. And so, as just one example, I was, of course, as Sue was speaking, some work that we've done sort of brings to light from a data perspective that lesbians and bisexual women and trans men have reproductive right issues and have abortions. And so the work that Planned Parenthood does intersects, of course, with what we do. As another example, just this past year, my colleagues and I published a study finding significant overrepresentation of LGBT people in prisons and jails. You may be surprised to learn that more than 30% of women in prisons and jails across the United States identify as lesbian or bisexual. And among youth in custody, more than 60% of girls identify as sexual minorities. And so for us, what that shows is that criminal justice issues, or the criminal justice issues that our country is grappling with, are also LGBT issues. And that we find and not just an overrepresentation of LGBT people in prisons and jails, but that when you look within the facilities, they have differential experiences. For example, much higher rates of sexual victimization and administrative segregation. One of the other issues that we worked on, and I'm going to get to the sort of challenge that we have faced this year, two sort of legal questions that we have been working on are the way in which federal law that prohibits sex discrimination covers sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. As everyone probably knows, but you may not, federal laws that prohibit discrimination in employment or in housing and other spaces do not expressly prohibit sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination, but they do prohibit sex discrimination. Under the Obama administration, we made great progress in President Obama issuing executive orders and his administration issuing regulations that extended sex discrimination protections to LGBT people for sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. That was a great win, buttressed by numerous decisions from federal courts. What we've seen from the Trump administration is a rollback of these regulations and protections for LGBT people. Related to that, or sort of in tandem, the other big issue that we've seen, and I will be very eager for Sue and others' thoughts on this, is the clashing of religious liberty claims with reproductive rights and LGBT rights. And hopefully we'll have time to talk about that more, but I will save my time for now.
Josie, you're primarily working with a lot of undocumented individuals, and you're working in sort of an artistic, creative space. How has the last year impacted your work, and what have you seen as the biggest challenge of the last year?
Hi, everybody. My name is Josie Maran. I am the artist in residence at Define American. We're a media organization that focuses on holding media accountable in regards to the portrayal of immigrants, and more specifically undocumented immigrants in this country. I don't know if you could tell, but I'm undocumented. If you don't know what an undocumented person looks like, this is how we look like. Feel free to take a picture with me after. There is 11 million undocumented people in this country. I came to the country when I was 3 years old, so I was raised here. A lot of people always ask me, why don't you just get in line? There's no line, just jump on Google and find out. So one of the things that we're seeing right now, specifically with undocumented communities, is that we're heavily under attack. There was a program, an executive order that Obama signed called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which means folks within my predicament that came at a young age and were raised in this country, went through the educational system, qualified for a work permit, and were saved from deportation. That was rescinded in September, so meaning the program is no longer in effect. We're still debating what we're gonna happen. I am what they call a dreamer. And so what's happening right now is we're leaving 800,000 DACA recipients in limbo. So these are people like myself who are not, like we hear the debate about kids. I am about to be 30 years old. There's nothing about me as a child except how this country patronizes me. So we're leaving these folks in limbo, but right now the debate is, the scary thing is that Trump came out with these points of like under what conditions he would legalize folks like me, meaning he was open to legalizing about 1 million folks, but ignoring the fact that there's 11 million. So what's gonna happen to the other folks? So right now we're in this weird place in which people in my job predicament are being used as bargain tools for something that's a little bit more destructive. And so what we're doing with my organization is we're really looking at the way in which we kind of infiltrate and create a cultural shift, so we are not, it's one thing is policy, but the other way is like you need to create an atmosphere in which folks are becoming more exposed and actually really admitting, like, no, you might know an undocumented person, and they might not necessarily be, you know, the person that's cleaning your house, or necessarily being the person that, you know, that or necessarily be Mexican. Like, they could be your doctors, they could be your nurses, firefighters, right? These people are excelling and they're just as American as you are. So that's why we're kind of like, with the organization, the work that we do is try to tell those stories that have more nuance and more complexity, as opposed to stories based on fear, and also like try to move away from this good immigrant, bad immigrant kind of dichotomy that a lot of us undocumented people, you know, get portrayed in. Like, I'm not saving babies from a burning building. I'm just, you know, trying to be myself and contribute as much as possible to my local community. But yeah, I think right now the biggest challenge is that a lot of people feel that immigration does not affect them, or there has no parallel. But immigration, I think, connects across the board with all the work that we're doing. Yeah, so I look forward to having a more in-depth conversation about that.
That's great. And Maria, that's a great segue to you, because you are here on a work visa. You are actually from Sweden originally, where you worked on LGBT issues. You work more in the international space as part of an advocacy organization that is trying to advance LGBTQ rights throughout the world. So what has been the biggest challenge for you in the last year?
I mean, I think Outright has been around for 27 years. So it means we were founded in 1990 in the George Bush era. So we're not exactly used to having the American government support what we do in promoting LGBTIQ rights around the world. That said, of course, I mean, Hillary Clinton made a speech at the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2011 saying, basically, gay rights are human rights. And that is something that we all know in this room. And that's pretty much a given here in West Hollywood. But when you look around the world at the 193 member countries of the United Nations, it is not a given. And so, of course, having a US government and an administration who does not believe, basically, that human rights are important enough to talk about, it does make a difference. So, for example, I'm sure all of you might have heard last year of the atrocities, like, we're coming out of Chechnya, where the Chechen regional government, well, they didn't exactly arrest, that sort of makes it sound as if they were sort of following the law, but they put a lot of people in prison, tortured them, at least confirmed, we know that at least 3 of them died. And we could not get the US government to speak out against this when it happened. And that, of course, it does make a difference. We need international support when things like this happen. But I also want to put what's happening in this country in sort of in the context of the global view, because actually I've done this kind of work for, well, about 15 years. And I think last year, it was for me like the worst year. We heard about significant, large-scale government crackdowns on LGBTIQ communities in Chechnya, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Indonesia, Egypt, and Tanzania. And those were like the ones that made big news, where lots of people were arrested and the government stepped up their persecution. And this is not, I mean, what we're seeing now is a global development. And of course, when the President of the United States expresses his admiration for the strong men like Putin, like Sisi in Egypt, like Duterte in the Philippines, and many others, it contributes to making it more legitimate for these strong men to attack many different communities and minorities, including LGBTIQ people. So I think, yes, things in this past year have been harder, definitely, but I think we're also seeing more resistance. So I don't know. I mean, I think you have to take the long view and remain optimistic in spite of everything.
So I'm going to ask you all to step out a little bit from what you typically work on. we know that all of these forms of discrimination, violations of human rights, they overlap, they are not isolated, and then we see people try to pit one discriminated group against another. But most of you work in certain, I don't want to say silos because we can't work in silos, but you work in a particular area. If you were to step outside of that area, what other challenge do you think exists in terms of human rights? What is the other thing that has you most concerned as you're looking at the last year in human rights and civil liberties? And Sue, you're looking very thoughtful there, so I'm going to turn to you.
Oh, I was looking forward to everyone else's answer. All right. Well, I'm struggling with stepping outside because, much as we pointed to, I genuinely feel that the day-to-day of Planned Parenthood and so much of our work truly is intersectional. So that's what I was struggling with, was trying to think of what was outside. But that said, perhaps if I was working outside of the day-to-day of our collective work, I think I would, as much as I'm really proud of the way that advocates and scholars and voters and activists have come together, I think this is a moment where we need to do more. I can't tell you what more looks like, but I mean, I truly feel that we're in a moment in time that is a turning point. And I hope that on the other side is equality, is democracy, is so many of the values that underlie what we're talking about. But I'm also very afraid that that may not be the case. And so when I think about it that way, I don't know what more looks like, but I don't think we can do enough.
Josie, you're looking like you want to jump in, and then Salam has a thought on this as well.
I think, you know, I think in the organization I think we've reached a point in the country where, you know, we cannot necessarily say cannot necessarily just advocate for one group. I think once Trump's got elected, we all sat there on our TV like, damn, they're going to come after all of us. And so I think one of the things is like this idea that in a way it needs to be, all the work needs to be intersectional. And I think that's one of the, I don't necessarily say it's a good thing that came from this, but the idea that social movements cannot exist without, you know, all the communities being involved and everybody having a seat at the table. Like, you cannot say, you know, that you are pro-migrant if you don't believe that Black Lives Matter. Like, everything needs to be kind of interconnected. I think for me, like, one of the things that we're not looking at a lot of times is mass incarceration is like a big thing, a problem in this country. And I think right now, one of the things that we're doing a lot, specifically with immigration, is that we made it a Latino issue, we made it a Mexican thing, and we're not necessarily representing adequately the global crisis. And even with refugees, there's a fine line between being undocumented and a refugee, and we're not looking at it from that global perspective of the fact that people are leaving their homes to come to the places that colonized them or the places that exploited them. But for me, within that lens of looking at mass incarceration, we also start to think that mass incarceration is a Black issue, right? And we're not really looking at the fact that we don't consider immigration detention centers part of that scheme, and the fact that most of the immigration detention centers are being populated by undocumented people who are not necessarily just Latino, necessarily Mexican, and whose these detention centers are, you know, private businesses. So I think it's just everything, and I think within organizations that's what we strive to kind of build for, try to have that representation across the board, that it's more intersectional, and it's bringing other things to light.
Yes, Salam, jump in.
Just a few weeks after Trump was elected, then the issue of immigration came up and the issue of the undocumented came up. We had a school that was just a few blocks from our office where, and I think many of you will probably remember this story, where a father dropped off his daughter for school, and after he dropped her off at school, DHS, Homeland Security, came in and arrested him, detained him, and took him to a deportation center. And that brought out to me a lot of intersectionality. My family's from Iraq, and my father was in prison in Iraq about 6 times. And after the 6th time, he decided that was it. He fled persecution from Iraq. So it brought memories of my father being taken away by the secret police, that this is what is happening now in the United States, that anyone can be grabbed and taken to jail for whatever reason. Today, it is the undocumented. Tomorrow, God knows who's going to be viewed as opposition or seditious or what have you. Anyone can be tarred and feathered and said and targeted by the government. And so what is at stake is equality under the law. We cannot have the rule of law work for the people unless there is equality of the law. Without equality of the law, then the rule of law becomes an instrument of oppression against communities and against minorities. So that is what, took us out of our, out of our lane and saw what was happening around us that really is impacting all of us. And also, when there was the travel ban, I went to LAX for the protest to find that there were no Muslims protesting. It was 10,000 non-Muslims who came out and were pouring their support for people they don't even know, the people that they would never meet. And to me, that was an inspiration to see 10,000 people come out and defend the rights of others. The last thing is the Orlando incident, and I think you're alluding to that earlier. Trump tried to exploit the Orlando situation by driving a wedge between the LGBTQ community and the Muslim community. And he tried to say that, I don't know exactly what he said, and it wasn't that intelligent anyway, so it doesn't matter. But he was trying to drive the wedge. What was important is that that night after, or the next day after the Orlando incident, we had a vigil at the Islamic Center. And we invited the religious community and the civil rights community and the LGBTQ community, and we prayed together, we cried together, and we sang together. And that was a moment of solidarity that no one was going to divide us. No one was going to pit one community against another community. And we declared that evening that we will be the shield against any kind of hate, whether it's coming from my community to the LGBTQ community or vice versa, or the Jewish community and the Muslim community. We will be the shield against any kind of hate that's coming from the outside. So to us, that was a very important moment in developing solidarity and also understanding the nexus of Islamophobia and transphobia and homophobia in our society, that they are one and the same.
Great. Maria, I know that you believe in working across different lines and how important it is to work outside of silos. But stepping aside for a moment from the work you're doing on LGBTQ issues, what other issue has you staying up at night and worrying and fretting about the state of our world?
Well, I think that the travel ban and the Islamophobia has been, it's obviously something that it's not a separate issue. We work on issues related to Iran. We have an Arabic media project where we're looking at homophobia and transphobia in media in the Arab world. But the travel ban and the hate of Muslims that have been so expressed and so sort of become sort of part of a public discourse, even more so, I think, in the last year than previous. That has been, of course, it's been a big issue for us. I mean, in part also because, I mean, we work with lots of people from the Middle East and North Africa. So it's like when we bring activists from those countries to come advocate with us at the United Nations, and a couple of them are, you know, they're questioned. It takes them forever to get through immigrations because they are being held for extra questioning. So it's like, it hits very close to home. But I mean, the thing that I think, what I've also seen, I'm currently based in New York, and I think that there were lots of protesting around the travel ban, and I think the LGBTIQ community came out to protest. And I think that is also something that's incredibly important. It's like, we don't lead single issue lives, but sometimes, even if you feel that something is not directly related to you, you actually just have to go out and protest. You have to go to the airport, or as in New York, we did protests at the Stonewall monuments. It's like, you have to go there, you have to show up, and you just have to protest. And so I think that's one of the many things that.
And Adam, you talked about this earlier, about how LGBTQ issues are not just about the community, that we actually span all of the communities, and sometimes in ways that are not always understood or not always recognized. But apart from LGBTQ issues, what other issues do you think have been most challenging in the last year?
Sure. Let me answer that question in a moment. But first, I just want to note, I agree with Salam and the others that questions, I think maybe we could describe it as sort of formal equality, where the law treats people equally and the same, is an important condition. But in addition, we need to think about what are the circumstances and conditions that would allow people to have the capabilities, the opportunities to have full, fulfilling, secure lives. And equality before the law, we know, is necessary but not sufficient to that sort of vision of the world, right, where people can all live productive and happy lives. To the question that you posed to me of sort of what, in addition, keeps me up at night, and that I don't actually see often weaved into the work of many of us, unfortunately, is concerns about the environment and what the Trump administration has done through the Environmental Protection Agency, through the USDA, and numerous other agencies to roll back protections for our environment. And I think that there's an undeveloped human rights and perspective on the environment. For example, we know that these extreme weather occurrences come down particularly hard on poor and vulnerable people. As I understand what happened in Houston, for example, it was people who were living in the lowest sort of flood areas who tended to be poor who were most impacted and displaced from their homes. And so that's just Houston. There's, I think, many examples in which we can do some sort of human rights analysis on environmental changes and the way in which what's happening to our environment is irreversible.
A number of you have talked about the overlap of race with the different issues that you work on, and some of you work directly on issues of race. And I was struck by your comments, Salam, about Islamophobia and how the overlap with people of color. So certainly people from the Middle East, and there's also phobia about Arabs and Persians, and some of that is overlapping. Muslims that might look like me probably don't face the same degree of scrutiny and the same degree of discrimination because of that overlap of race. And Planned Parenthood, I know that women of color have disproportional problems in terms of accessing reproductive care. So I'm wondering if that might be something that you'd like to address, and how race factors into the work that all of us do, and the particular impact that it has.
Well, I mean, from my standpoint, my work and religion, the greatest threat to religion is not secularism. The greatest threat to religion is religious nationalism. When groups use religion as a vehicle for power, and it's not about religion anymore, it's about power. When we look at the monotheistic faiths and the message of Jesus and the message of Moses and the message of Muhammad, all of them were based on a fundamental principle of defending human dignity. Without human dignity, there could have never been the three great monotheistic faiths. And religion then becomes a vehicle for exploitation. So preserving human dignity means that we have to fight religious nationalism. And religious nationalism in America is basically, it takes the form of white nationalism. Evangelicals joining the alt-right and forming a movement that has nothing to do with religion. And justifying atrocious behavior, like justifying the behavior of that senatorial candidate in Alabama, Roy Moore, who molested young women, and evangelical preachers coming out and saying, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. Prophets used to do the same thing. It's just ridiculous that they try to use religion to justify that kind of behavior. And then when you look to the Middle East, religious nationalism in the form of Arab nationalism or Persian nationalism or whatever the state, that country is, using religion by one group that believes in an ideology, and that ideology becomes the religion. So it is actually idolatrous to replace religion with an ideology and say everybody now has to fall in line with that. That kind of religious nationalism threatens the very ethics and the essence of these religions and distorts it from within. And this is the inner struggle that we are having as Muslims in terms of defining what is Islam in the modern era. Is it going to be confrontational with everything that is different from it, or is it going to work in constructive engagement in being a part of modern civilization? And then you see even Jewish nationalism in Israel, where the Israeli right has decided that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. So religious nationalism dehumanizes the other, whatever that other is, however you want to define that other. It dehumanizes, that leads to human rights violations, that moves it further and further away from religious ethics. And therefore, reform is a must within each and every religion. And for Islam, as I said before, there's this notion of Islam versus the West. So the extremists on both sides, the white nationalists in the West and the Muslim nationalists in the Middle East, they are opposite sides of the same coin. They're at war with each other, and they believe that Islam and the West will always be at war with each other. The answer to that, to this paradigm of Islam versus the West, is to show Islam within the West. That is an integral, effective, vibrant element of our pluralism. That is a part of society that represents human dignity the way it was meant to be. That is actually defined in the Quran, the verse in the Quran that humanity is bestowed with human dignity. And that God had bestowed that human dignity to all of humanity. So we have to reframe the issue of having religious wars with one another to religious reconciliation and religion becoming a part of the movement for human dignity.
You really turned the question around and in a great way about religion and religious nationalism, and I thought the way you framed it was great. Josie, earlier today you talked a little bit about immigration and race and how people view undocumented people in a certain way. They view undocumented people as primarily Mexican, but you have some information that that's not exactly accurate.
Yeah, so one of the things that we do, like I said, we live in a cultural war. Like, I think right now you can be debating with someone and you show them facts and analysis and research. And, I think right now we're living in the country, it has a white anxiety. People are really anxious because they don't know what's going to happen, right? And that's why, well, I think under Obama, there was this idea that we lived in a very progressive post-racial society. And then we just saw this huge reality that white supremacy is rampant, and sometimes white supremacy does not mean you're holding a tiki torch. It just means that you're not opening access to other communities that never had institutional power. I think when we talk about immigration, you have a president that tells you, like, oh, why are we taking in people from shithole countries? We should take people from Norway. That should be a clear testament to the fact that America is welcoming to a certain demographic of immigrants as opposed to a racialized component of immigrants. And we talk about the other, oftentimes the other has been a framework that has existed and been constructed by the white imagination, because as people of color, we still don't have access to that power. Right now, one of the things we talk about a lot is building the wall. And the reality is that most people who were coming through that wall are not necessarily coming anymore. It's like when the club is packed already and it's over, people are like, I'm not coming no more, let me go somewhere else. I feel like that's how Mexicans are, like, we're out, y'all handle yourselves. Most people that are coming into the country are actually folks that are overstaying their visa, and increasingly amount of folks that have overstayed visas. So they're not coming through the desert or through a wall. So I think but that doesn't fit that kind of framework, or that framework that Trump has been talking about. And I think for me, like, it's very daunting to talk about the fact that all this stuff is happening. I think on a deeper spiritual level, I think we're living in a country that lacks empathy, and I think that's it. I think and maybe it's like the poetic term, but I think as people, one of the things I think it's definitely looking at a way that we can step outside of ourselves and our own fears and our own anxiety to just simply connect on a human level, because at the end of the day, we're all striving for the same thing, right? Living lives that are hopefully full of joy. I don't know if you want to live a life that's just looking at your neighbor like, oh, look at them, they have more stuff than me, like they're taking my job. And most likely, I hate the people that said that I'm stealing their job. Most likely you're not qualified, because I went to school, I did this, check my resume. So I think in general, yeah, I think we really do live, we're facing that. And the challenge in that is really challenging our own family members at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, and not really like, I tell people, like, yeah, if you have a family member that believes that I'm taking their job, you should engage with them, because ultimately, most likely they're getting blocked on Facebook by everybody else, and all they're getting is their own people that are reaffirming that stuff. So I think, yeah, a level of empathy, really try to find out where that spiritual bankruptcy is coming from. But yeah, racism sucks.
Yeah, I'd offer you one statistic as a starting point, that Black women across the country have an infant mortality rate 3 times that of white women. That's true all across the country, and it's true here in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, poor birth outcomes are clustered in South Los Angeles and East Los Angeles. So what do we do about that? We have to understand that that's structural racism. That's not just, let's put a clinic here and everything will be better. That's about sort of centers of poverty, institutional racism, a world that's been constructed to leave some people out at best. And so then, what do you do? I think in this moment, there are steps we can take. So for example, Planned Parenthood is partnering with Martin Luther King Hospital to provide prenatal care. I don't offer you that though as a solution, but as a step. I think so that when we think about reproductive health care, but we shift that lens and we think about reproductive justice, because we know that in different communities, different people with different levels of access to care, to jobs, to education, that all of those things impact your ability to have the birth control method you need at the moment you need it. And so it's all of our job to understand that all of these things come together. I'd sort of point to the comment about sort of leaving out environmental concerns. When we think about reproductive justice and poor birth outcomes, we also have to understand that poorer communities tend to have more environmental toxins in them. I mean, that irrespective of maybe you ate all the right food, you went to all the prenatal appointments, you as an individual did everything right, you nevertheless live in an environment that makes it really difficult, if not impossible, for you to have a healthy baby and a healthy family. And so I think that when we think about racism, we have to understand that racism is not outside of any one of the things that we're talking about, but that racism, at least, and I mean at least in this country, is front and center in any of our conversations around justice. And I think each of us is talking about justice from a slightly different lens.
Well, you kind of segued us into things that we can do. And I think that's what a lot of people come out to these kind of programs, not only to hear from you about your perspectives and the work you're doing, but I think there's been in this last year a real desire on the part of people to connect with organizations, connect with other people. What would you recommend that people do if they're concerned about all of human rights and civil liberties and the particular issues that you're working on? Maria, you're looking like you're eager.
I mean, we work internationally, but we can only do the work that we do thanks to support in all parts of this country and around the world. And so we're expanding our presence in Los Angeles. We'll be coming out here more. We have sort of the start of a local group that's going to support us and make us more visible, put our name out, help us fundraise, because everything that we want to do obviously costs money. So, I mean, please talk to me over the desserts after. We want to connect with you. If you think that LGBTIQ rights are of concern and you have a global outlook on things, we want to connect with you. So I think that's definitely what everyone here should do.
Adam, you look like you want to jump in.
Sure, I would just sort of echo what Maria said, that donating to existing organizations, there's a great infrastructure represented by these organizations and many others that are doing fantastic work that need support. But donating money is not, of course, the only way. You can volunteer at these organizations. And then the third suggestion, this is the one that I really would like to know the answer to, is if someone could figure out the new Facebook algorithm for how they're doing the news feed. I mean, I think if we need to know, because
Can't we just hire trolls to do that?
I mean, that is how people get so much information, is through Facebook, and will figure out how to manipulate that algorithm, and it has to be, I think we need to be very aware of how people get information and the limited information that they receive.
Salam?
Ditto.
Okay.
But I think one additional point is that I think our organizations, among others, should really start thinking about the 2018 elections, and let's take and let's take the energy in the protests. Let's take the energy in this room and all the forums. We've been talking a lot. It's time to really make that, turn that and transform it into the vote. And maybe, LA, we're okay. I don't know. I haven't done my analysis yet on the candidates. But maybe in the outskirts of LA, we need to strategically provide resources for our allies. For example, Steve Knight's district in Santa Clarita, or Dana Rohrabacher's district in parts of Orange County and others, maybe we need to start supporting our communities there to make sure that we get the vote out and mobilize our voters so that these elected officials really feel the power of the people.
Sue?
Yeah, I would build on that by suggesting that we tell our stories. So when we think about voting, all of the research about this election is telling us right now that voters don't want to vote against something. They want to vote for something. So if we just go forward and talk about what's wrong, we're not going to motivate a new generation of voters and the voters that we're all afraid may stay home. So what I would encourage all of us to do is think about telling our stories. One of the things that I think that you're doing so brilliantly tonight is by sort of putting a face on undocumented immigration. One thing that you said that I'm going to steal for my own purposes was there's no good immigrants and there's no bad immigrants. But now I want you to take that to the world of Planned Parenthood. We know that in our traditional narrative, there are good abortions and there are bad abortions. But I think we're all working towards a world where the everyday nature of who we are needs to be normalized, and we don't want to, I think, start to privilege or look for what's that story that's going to get that one voter, but rather sort of move forward with stories that help people understand the basic humanity of all of us, that your humanity and your experience is no more or less than mine, that my abortion is no worse or better than someone else's. And I think that in that storytelling and in that being vulnerable, we start to move forward at a time when we're really trying to focus on one or two ways of being an American when we know that there's no such thing.
And Josie, you really work in this area of telling stories and trying to make sure the media has a broad array of stories of immigrants and undocumented immigrants. How do you do that work? And tell us a little bit about what it is that you do to try to influence the media to tell more complete stories or more inclusive stories?
Yeah, so right now what we're trying to do is definitely hold newsrooms accountable with terminologies such as calling people illegal. When you call someone illegal, you necessarily, being undocumented in this country, there's no illegalities, it's a civil offense. So stuff like that I think you being mindful of the words that we use when we're talking about undocumented people. One of the other things that we're doing also, it's with our media and entertainment department, how do we get more storylines of undocumented folks into the mainstream? If most of the information that people are getting is from Facebook, and most people watch a lot of TV, most people do not like to read. I know sometimes you reblog an article just because the article was the title was catchy, but you didn't read the bottom to tell you that, oh, this was The Onion, So I think it's very important to also infiltrate that, to analysis of what are the TV shows that people who are suffering from these anxieties. We've seen the effect that Will and Grace had, right? And so how do we create more platforms for others to be involved in that? So we're consulting with writers to get more storylines in the media. And I think for me, I think one of the most important things for every American is to really become aware of your history, read the books, they're not necessarily the books you were taught in school, but the history of this country, and really acknowledge the fact of the liberties that we have in this country have cost people of color a lot, because it's always been people of color who have been leading this movement to have the liberties that we have here today. And I think one of the questions that I leave people with is what side are you on? When we look back at this moment of this Trump era, what are you going to tell your grandparents or your grandchildren of where were you at? What were you doing in those moments, and how are you becoming involved? I think showing up civically and showing up for other people, it makes a huge difference. And one of the things that we're seeing right now, specifically with people who are being deported or who are in deportation proceedings, is the effect that the public outcry has in allowing people to either stay or just the visibility of people becoming aware of and then research shows that most Americans are pro an immigration reform, but just because that passed does not necessarily mean that this country will not continue to displace people globally. I think, yeah, just become more aware of your history and read James Baldwin. He'll get you together.
That's great. We've been going for about an hour with the panel, and I know that people in the audience have some questions, and Corey's going to help us here with questions. So just raise your hand if you have a question. I see this gentleman here and in the back, and is that Barbara? Okay, yeah.
Oh, yeah, and if you could keep this to succinct questions, that I think everybody will appreciate that. So thank you. This is also, just so everybody knows, this is being recorded. And if you know people who couldn't come and want to see it, it'll be on the WehoTV channel on YouTube and on the city's website at weho.org, and it'll usually go up within a day. So.
Hi, my name is Jason. I live in WeHo. I actually do a lot of volunteer work with Shalem probably didn't mention directly, Swing Left. If anyone wants to know about that, let me know. But I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that Sue mentioned about, steps, and Josie talked about empathy, and Adam talked about environment. It seems like in West Hollywood, now is the perfect time to double down on what we believe, to fight against what some of the Trump administration is doing. What additional steps are we doing? Like, I think we all probably just like, oh, we're heading in the right direction, the environment is gonna be great, and we'll just follow what Obama and then Hillary's gonna do, and that didn't happen. So if we really truly believe in those things, should we, as a city, take more powerful steps now?
Are you?
That's your question.
You're asking.
That's to
okay.
you, the city.
It's not just to the panelists. Okay. Actually, after the election, we really did decide that we were going to reenact our sanctuary city ordinance. We have adopted a climate action plan, knowing that we're not going to get any leadership out of Washington, and we are moving forward with implementing that. We have really tried to up our social services funding, knowing that a lot of our organizations are going to be impacted by the policies. Planned Parenthood is now one of our funded social service agencies. So we were one of the cities that endorsed the Women's March downtown and provided transportation for our residents. So absolutely, I think it's really clear that the change that we want to see happen, the positive change that we want to see happen, is going to happen at the local level. And we've had the experience of living through some pretty dreadful presidents and some governors who've not been supportive of our agenda, and we've found ways to navigate what they're doing as well as advance the agenda, even though the federal government or the state may not have been supportive. So we're going to continue doing that. I'd be glad to talk more about that too. And there were two people in the back, and I'm sorry, I can't really see up here with the lights very well.
My name is Ashley Marie Preston, and thank you all for your input. And I'm really grateful that Sue spoke up about Black women and reproductive rights, because as a Black trans woman, I'm a little uncomfortable that I'm sitting in a forum discussing human rights and civil liberties, but there are no Black or trans representation on a panel. And this is an opportunity for the LGBTQ community to be really intentional, especially since when we look at the anniversary of Stonewall that just passed, and the fact that everything that we're talking about and that we have today as the LGBTQ community was brought to us by Black and brown trans women. And so my question to the panel is, it's not enough to really say, like, we need to reach out to people, but what are we intentionally doing in these organizations to reach out to communities that might not otherwise be represented on our day-to-day interaction?
I think one of the things, yeah, that's definitely, thank you for bringing that analysis. I think for us specifically within immigration space that we're seeing right now is how even like the national movements or the national leaders, it was kind of like this idea that if we make a Latino issue, it was gonna move forward, right? And the reality is that, specifically immigration is such a global issue, so you can't necessarily say that. But once you make it that, you're erasing so many other folks. And I think one of the things that we're specifically being mindful within our organization, one, is hard to get undocumented people to even come out or to like want to be in the media or talk to folks. So you need to really build a sense of trust. On top of that, one of the things that we're seeing is like the activism that a lot of folks are doing specifically right now to organize undocumented Black folks to kind of have that kind of visibility, because that's another community that's getting deported at a much higher rate than brown communities, because those same resources are not necessarily applied to them. One of the things that happen right now is the temporary protection status that a lot of right now it's El Salvador and folks from Haiti lost, and I think there's not a lot of activism in increasing that visibility. So for us, it's really engaging with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and the Undocumented Black Network, which is an undocumented Black grassroots organization that focuses on shifting perceptions of immigration. But yeah, I definitely agree with you that I think it's not necessarily about how do we engage with folks, but how to give those folks a platform to have access for resources. Because if you're having a grassroots organization that's dedicated to advocating for Black undocumented folks, but they don't have an infrastructure and nobody's funding them because they're funding a big organization that's ignoring them, there really is an inequity. So for us, it's like, how do we uplift those organizations so the funding is going to them or to the people who are impacted at the forefront?
Yes, Sue.
Yeah, and Ashley, what I would offer is that I think you're pointing to exactly the right question, which is that we need to do better. And I also see this as a moment in time where we, people like myself, who lead organizations that have done a type of work in a traditional way, aren't necessarily going to be the people, and you weren't saying that, but I am, who have those answers. And so I think it's time for us to see that, as a social service provider, as a healthcare provider, we've done a lot of good work for a very long time, but we still see some incredible inequities along the lines of race. And trans communities are very much just plain old left out of the data, as you well know. So then how do we approach healthcare, and that's my work, right? How do we approach healthcare, not just from you as an individual in your body, as sort of body parts, but start to look at sort of the social justice lens or equity as not just being, you come to me, I fix your STD, you're fine, but why are there more STDs in sort of, let's say, Black and brown communities that are poorer? So it's both. So at Planned Parenthood, it's our job to meet the people who come to us where they are and address the needs that walk through the door around basic health care. But it's also time for us, and it's been this time for a long time, but I think we're at a moment, not just for Planned Parenthood, but in the world of healthcare, where we're starting to ask the questions about, okay, the Affordable Care Act, let's believe that that's a step towards healthcare for all. But the healthcare system in this country hasn't worked. So how do we do better? And that's not about me getting you one really good doctor visit or making sure that the 3 times you come to the ER you're taken care of, but that we're addressing all of the social determinants of healthcare. And I think a lot of that's going to come from folks in power doing more to listen and step back. But I think we're in the midst of change, but we can't quite see what comes next. And I don't think that's a good enough answer, but that's my answer for now. And I hope that you'll keep asking and making sure that we all do better. And that's not your job, it's all of our jobs, but we all have to raise our voices.
Maria?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as an organization that works globally, obviously, one of the things that we do is, I mean, predominantly, many of the countries that have, for example, like criminalize same-sex behavior or persecute trans people, they were the former colonies. I mean, you were the one who brought that up. And of course, I mean, many of the people, we believe that change has to come from inside a society. And as an international organization, what we can do is try to accelerate it. But, I mean, for us, for example, one example is when we bring activists to speak to governments in New York, we think very carefully about who is going to each meeting. So we had a meeting, we managed to secure a meeting with the Jamaican ambassador. He was very reluctant to take the meeting with us. And he was kind of shocked when the delegation came, and it was a very good, he couldn't sort of help himself when he sort of expressed his surprise, because he expected some white Americans to come to this meeting to tell him what a bad record Jamaica has when it comes to homophobia and transphobia. And the group that came were a group of Black Caribbean activists and one Black badass South African lesbian. And so it sort of shifted the dynamics, because they were talking about their lived realities in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, and in South Africa. So I think for us, that is an incredibly important part. It's not just what you're saying, but it's also obviously who is saying it. And that is, I mean, it's obviously incredibly important. So thank you for raising the issue.
I would just add one concrete, sort of from a data perspective, one thing that is important to remember is our federal government doesn't collects very little data on the trans community and LGBT people more broadly. So for example, as you may or may not know, the decennial census, the census that we do every 10 years, and numerous other federal surveys that provide us with a wealth of data that's how we understand the disparities in our society. The census and these surveys do not ask people to self-disclose their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So with respect to federal data, we're totally blind. And at the Williams Institute, we have been advocating and making great progress, at least we did in the Obama administration, to convince federal agencies to add questions of sexual orientation and gender identity to surveys. So just one example, the National Crime Victimization Survey is an annual survey of hundreds of thousands of people, and it's representative of the nation. It's how we learn about criminal victimization of people in our society. 2 years ago, we convinced the Bureau of Justice Statistics to add sexual orientation and gender identity questions to that survey. So for the very first time in 2 years, we should be getting this wealth of data that we will be able to lift up sort of from a national perspective, important pieces of information about victimization, criminal victimization of LGBT people. But that's only one sort of part of the story, and I could say so much more about the difficulties we have had on on data collection issues with the Trump administration. And I only just say that from a data perspective, that these complement, I think, the individual stories that you're talking about, and that these provide sort of different lenses on ways in which to understand all of the issues that we're talking about.
Salam, I'm going to ask you to respond a little bit to that question, because I think there is this narrative in this country that Muslims and gays are two separate communities, that all Muslims are anti-gay, and there's actually been an effort to foster that kind of division between the two communities. How do you deal with issues of sexual orientation and outreach within your own Muslim community of people who are LGBTQ, and how is that working for you, and what kind of challenges do you face?
Well, I mean, it is a challenge, because our community is still dealing with tradition that is based on scripture, not scripture, but texts from 1,000 years ago. And it's never been addressed. In some ways, it wasn't addressed because sexuality was never a public matter. In other words, the Islamic law at the time was whatever you did in the privacy of your bedroom is just that. And the Quran only mentions sexuality in terms of anyone that has sex in public. In other words, if it's a public act, a form actually of sexual aggression, that is what the Quran is referring to. It has to be witnessed by 4 people. And 1,400 years ago, that is pretty much something that is impossible to attain. But the point was that the verse was actually dealing with, you cannot prosecute anyone based on what they do in the privacy of their home. And so in terms of how we're dealing with sexual identity today and sexual orientation, it is work in progress. It's not, we're still far from achieving this idea of equality in terms of sexual orientation. However, I believe that especially in recent years, the idea of defending the civil rights and the human rights of the LGBTQ community and acknowledging there are Muslims who are also part of the LGBTQ community is a reality that now is forcing our congregations to begin having honest conversations about the issue. But I'll be very honest, we're far from really achieving any kind of resolution to it. And the fear of any kind of violence, harassment against individuals who are LGBTQ within our community is of great concern. And so it is being handled very delicately, but at the same time, there are people who are pushing the envelope to begin having conversations about it from a theological standpoint.
And we've had some of those people here as speakers right here in this auditorium, so it's great to see that that is a work in progress. I know that there are some other questions in the audience because Corey is out there.
Hi, my name is Elise Ruth. I live in West Hollywood. My question is for Sue Dunlap. I would like to make a contribution to Planned Parenthood in the name of Vice President Mike Pence and have you send him a thank you letter. Is that doable?
You can absolutely say yes. Let's give her a round of applause. Do you want the actual answer? So we were getting so many contributions, like thousands and thousands and thousands, in the name of Mike Pence, that it really made it incredibly difficult to process and make sure that he got those thank you letters. But yes is the shorter answer. And I very much appreciate that. Thank you, Elise.
I think all of the organizations would accept contributions and in his name. Yes, Nadia.
Good evening, Nadia Sutton, Stonewall Democratic Club. My question is, sometimes here in California and on the East Coast, we consider ourselves the belly button of the world. And what can we do? How can we reach out? What you as organizations can do to reach out to where we need people to be heard, which is in Middle America, both as organizations and as groups that can support other groups in Middle America to elect candidates that will give us our country back. Thank you.
That's a big question. Yeah. I mean, I think that question is not just a political question, it's a social and cultural question. And there's obviously a major divide in our country, a divide that really has not been seen for decades, if not a century, since the Civil War, or over a century. And I was on a plane with an evangelical leader, and I was giving that person statistics about how minorities have contributed and how we're involved and how we're actually integrated, because they make us sound like we're so alienated. And I quoted the study, and he said, the study is a lie. So you cannot argue with facts, unfortunately. They discount facts. But the effort of bridging the divide by engaging the other and working on a joint venture, a mutual endeavor of learning, that is, to me, the path that needs to be taken. It's a difficult path, and it's a long path, but trying to overpower the other side, I don't feel that can be done. That will probably divide our country even further, and it will give, the right wing, I think, what they want by us looking like we're the ones attacking them. So it is about bridging the divide, and it is about developing whatever common ground there is, and then if it means go into poor communities in the Midwest and develop food pantries to show that we, our organizations and our communities together are helping them, if that's what it takes, then we should think about doing things like that. If it means developing more stories about the doctors and the teachers and the lawyers who are defending people in the Midwest, we need more stories like that. We need things that bridge the divide. At the end of the day, I go to the Quran that tells me that truth and falsehood are never equal. The truth is that which benefits people and will remain on earth. Falsehood is that which is like the scum on the top of water that will float away. So it is not going to happen overnight, but in time, I do believe the truth will prevail.
I would just add to that, sorry. I agree that some people may not be persuaded by facts and evidence, but I think many people are. So in my experience, in the work that we do at the Williams Institute, we've worked with many different legislators in the South and in mountain states and other places where you might expect sort of no movement on LGBT issues. But then when you show them the people in their district actually identify as LGBT, their ears perk up because these are their constituents. And then sort of to Maria's point, when you bring them to meet with their policymakers, that can also make a difference. And so, well, I agree to a certain extent. I don't want to say that I think people do pay attention and can be moved by the data and by research and personal stories.
And if I could jump in too, I'd also like to suggest that there's both sort of what we can do in other parts of the country, but in all of our work, there's also what is the unique and important role of Los Angeles. And I think it's important for us to understand that we're playing a really key role in the resistance. So for example, in the context of Planned Parenthood, sadly, women are coming to Los Angeles for abortions from all over the country and all over the world. So I both want to make sure that we're reaching out and being a part of the work around social justice for other countries. But I also, when I think of some of the worst case scenarios that may not seem so far away, I also want us to be doing all that we can in Los Angeles and the places where we can do that work to make sure that we're here, and sanctuary is too strong of a word, but as a sanctuary for all the people across the country who don't have access and perhaps won't have access to so many of the resources that our local communities, West Hollywood being a great example, are committed to preserving.
My point is that they're not mutually exclusive. It's that there might be political ways of trying to assert influence and services provided to help people. But in terms of shifting culture, I think it's beyond politics and beyond legalities, let's say. We can get legal victories, but that won't help make an impact on the cultural change that we need. We need to work together to envision what should America look like 20 years from now, and then work for that vision and bring people on board for that. We need a movement. It's not just about resistance, what we're against, as you said, but what are we for? What is that America that we are for? That's what we have to define.
I'm going to just jump in too. I think we also have to be careful about stereotyping the Midwest, because there are a lot of people in the Midwest who are working very tirelessly on these social issues, and there are a lot of really great people there who have been fighting these fights along with us. So
yeah, and it's not just the
Midwest.
Midwest.
To work with them.
We got to work on Simi Valley. We got to work on La Cañada. We got to work on so many other parts just around us here,
John and I are both originally from the Midwest, so there.
There you go.
Well, my name is Alex Saldana. I originally live in downtown LA. So I first want to thank you all for your amazing conversation. I think it's really awakening and also refreshing to hear your commentary. But also wanted to highlight the facade of the conversation about the 1 year after inauguration. I think that there was, my personal perspective, there was not a year after. This has been ongoing for the past administrations. I think we just took off a mask and we're facing this systematic problem that is more visual, that is more vivid. I'm also undocumented. I'm also HIV positive. I'm not a dreamer. I'm an asylum refugee. So I live all the intersections. I'm also poor. And I also like to believe that in this level of me as a non-voter, as a non-citizen, that we also have a power. So my question is very intersectional, so it could be to all of you. We yet have to have accountability even in progressive spaces. That includes governments, cities, including the city of West Hollywood. So how do we have cities accountable at a local, at a federal level, and also internationally? As we're moving forward with this new administration, I've seen this, and forgive me for my vulgarity, the same shit every other day. So how can we have organizations that are progressive, that are LGBT, that are also receiving fundings to keep immigration detention centers open? How do we have cities like Los Angeles that continues to be not a sanctuary city, that continues to be the largest incarceration state in the country? How do we move forward? I know we talk about a lot of progressiveness, but how do we, even internationally, how do we become this outcry when refugees in Syria and also from Central America were at our doorstep and we didn't do anything?
Okay. Anyone want to try that one?
No, that's a big one, yeah. I think it goes also to the question, I forgot who asked, who made that point is, I mean, I work every day, in terms of how do I respond to the news? How do I, give a comment? How do we as an organization, work to get our community more civically engaged? But I think the deeper issue and the more profound issue is how do we as organizations work to defend the vulnerable? It's not just about us. It's about, the work, and again, going back to religious tradition, in terms of its essence, what the great prophets did was they worked for vulnerable communities. They worked they defended the outcasts. They defended the dispossessed. They defended those that were thrown to the side, and worked with them and lived with them. And that's where I see, like for myself, that's the struggle that I have to be more involved in, is to think about ways to help the vulnerable.
I think that's exactly right. And I actually imagine my work the same way, which is how to reduce vulnerability among many different axes for people. So I just agree 100%.
I mean, I think for us and a lot of the work that we do, and I mean, some of the countries where we do work are very, very challenging. And we're not going to see change there on LGBTIQ issues. It's not going to happen in 10 years or 20 years. Or 50 years, but I think it's pushing forward like everywhere where you can, and really not giving up. And it's like one of the things that inspire me is working with colleagues around the world in situations that are extremely difficult, and I think it's like, I mean, we invited the vice mayor of, we do a lot of work in the Philippines. We invited the vice mayor of Quezon City to join us in December at a conference. And I mean, the reason we invited her in particular was because there are many similarities between Duterte and Trump. They're two strong men who, won't publicly for sure speak about human rights. But so even if you can't really make progress at the federal level, you can work with, there can be champions and leaders at other levels. The vice mayor of Quezon City is a great example of that. She leads with human rights on multiple issues. And I mean, we see that around in this country as well. It's like, you can make progress at other levels. And I mean, that's what you have to do. I think that is what I look to when I come up against a despair that if I thought too much about it.
I think we have time for one more, and I've been told the dessert is out there, so you're going to have the last question tonight.
Thank you. Good evening. I congratulate Maria Sadogin for the internationalization of the human rights and civil liberties. My question is, which is one activity that we can do to feel more at ease with each other, to ease tension, to make a less stress.
Okay, so given the stressful environment we're in with incredible challenges to human rights and civil liberties, and people feeling more and more marginalized, how do we kind of find some peace in the world, and how do we get comfortable with one another and supporting one another in the work that we do? I mean, I think these kind of panels where we do get to talk together and speak with one another and share our perspectives is part of it, but any other ideas? We should all have dessert together. You're not on the mic, so we're not capturing you on TV.
Not listening.
Can,
We need to listen.
can you make it quick? Just so they can respond.
I just think that the answer to your question is an answer that Sue gave, which is we proceed by listening to one another. In brief, of course, you have to say hello first. But after that, the next step is listening and hearing intelligently what the others have to say.
Yeah, I think for me, like I think when Trump got elected, it was really, really daunting. And I'm not gonna be like, oh my God, it was like, I can't believe this happened. And it was a realization, like I knew this country was, I thought y'all were cool, but then I was like, okay, never mind. But it was really daunting because I felt like everything everybody was fighting for was kind of like, it didn't matter. But then, I'm a writer, I'm an avid reader, and then I look at my bookshelf and I have a collection of books by other writers who have faced times like these, right? The reason people wrote is to give other people hope. And I think that was important for me growing up as somebody that couldn't travel, or someone that wasn't aware of where his future was gonna be, is this idea of having an imagination or envisioning something bigger, something broader, and realizing that, James Baldwin said, like, right, we build these totem poles of power because at the end we all just fear death. And that's why I don't know, it's just a human condition. But for me, like, I think it was more like, how do I become, what books taught me was empathy. And I like to repeat that. It's just because, not sympathy, because I don't think that does anything for anybody. It's empathy, and the fact that we're all trying to figure out or make a sense of our messy lives. And there really, really isn't a clear answer. Some use different methods to find a sense of wholeness. But for me, it's just that, like, just be a decent human being. And I don't know if what decent has anything to it, but, just find a level of connection. And if you can't connect with somebody, really investigate where that's coming from. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing I want to take away from you. And yeah, like, just building that. And I think the other thing, also personal self-care, like, this is, anti-immigrant sentiment is not new to me. I've known it since I arrived here. So for me, it's always also unplugging, and sometimes just, sitting down in my house and not really thinking about this too much, because it can really take a toll on you and make you a really angry person. And the last thing I want to do is kind of be that.
So quick final words, because I'm being told that we have about 3 minutes left before we run out of tape. So any last thoughts on the last question we had?
I just wanted to say that, for Muslims, it was just a few years ago, 5 years ago, we were always fighting against this image that we are not terrorists. It's like Richard Nixon saying he's not a crook. And that is the only image you have of Muslims, is them saying we are not radicals, we're not terrorists, we're not extremists. So that's what you think of. That has changed now. I've had people who accused me of being a terrorist sympathizer and tried to exclude me from congressional commissions and even the city of LA and the county of LA work. Now they're calling and saying, if Muslims are going to have to register, then they are Muslims too. So that solidarity represents a tectonic shift in America. It's not just about Muslims. I think that this is the barometer that we're looking at to see that there are more communities coming together in solidarity. That's the silver lining, is that we are now coming together. So from the bad thing that happened a year ago, good things are coming out of it. And another example is now, you know, Muslims have over 50% favorability in the polls. It used to be, we were lucky if we had 20%. Trump has 36%. So we have more favorability than the president himself. That is historic. And it may be trivial, but it is important for us to see that positive aspect and to see the silver lining as we move forward, because we need that kind of faith, that boost to say, we're doing the right thing. We just got to keep moving on that arc of justice. As was stated before, it's not going to happen overnight. But if we, within our lives, develop the institutional work, then we can hand it over to the next generation to go further.
All right, I'm going to just wrap up here, and one final thought is, as we listen to one another, we have to stop thinking of us as other. We have to start thinking of us as all human beings, so that's part of what we have to do as well, and I think we've done a good job of that tonight. I want to, again, thank all of our panelists for being here tonight, sharing their thoughts, sharing their expertise. Thank all of you for being here tonight to share your ideas and thoughts, and please join us in the lobby for our dessert reception. And finally, I want to shout out to the Baldwin gentlemen again for their efforts in promoting tonight's event. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at our next Human Rights Speaker Series event. Thank you.